Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome back to OAG's latest webinar. It feels like quite a short space of time since the last one, I think just over 2 weeks. Normally we have a month between them, but the scheduling of the last one interfered with that a little bit, but we're delighted to be back. Today we're going to be looking at connectivity after the pandemic. So we'll do our usual look at regional recovery roundup, what's happening in different parts of the world and what does that mean for the summer season. We're also going to take a look at some of the large hub airports in Asia this time, and some of the country markets, and understand or seek to understand with my my speakers today what's really going on and how recovery is taking place or not, as the case may be. We'll also look at how regional connectivity has changed throughout the course of the pandemic, and we've got some interesting analysis to share with you. And sort of out of that, what does the future hold for the smallest of airports? What has the impact of the pandemic been on those airports? And then lastly, we'll take a look at cancellations. There's been a lot of media, particularly in Europe and the UK of late, as the summer season has started to ramp up with disruption and cancellations in airports. So we've pulled out some information and we'll talk to you a bit about that as well. As ever, please don't hesitate to ask us questions. You can see that we've all got cameras on today as well. So there's a first, although I think it's perhaps not the first time. I think we had a Christmas special once with cameras on, but we decided to open up our interesting facial expressions and all of that to you this morning as well. So hopefully it helps to put faces to the names and the voices that you always hear. Before we get started into the meat of the webinar today, and before I introduce my colleagues, we've got a question that we want to put to our audience, and that's really, what do you think? Which of different airport sizes, so large, medium, small, which has suffered the most loss to their networks throughout the pandemic? We're going to run a short poll, so you should see that come up on your screen. So please do give us your thoughts on that, and we'll leave it open for a minute or so. And once we get your responses, we'll come back to that. So looking forward to seeing what our audience think the impact has been. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panel this morning. So as ever, we have John Grant, OAG's Chief Analyst. Welcome, John.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I can't believe you made me put a t-shirt on this morning, Deirdre. I had to get up early and press it this morning to make sure all the lines are in the right places. So
well, that's it. There you go. There you go.
Yeah, looking forward to the chat.
It's the way forward, John. We'll get you on YouTube next. Okay, and Becca, we enjoyed the last webinar so much, having both of us on, that we decided we would do it again this time round. Welcome. You're normally in the seat that I'm in today, not physically, but yeah, thanks for joining us this morning as a speaker.
No, that's fine, and it's you know, I often end up doing some of the analysis behind the data that we show, and yeah, I've worked on some of the connectivity today, so it's quite nice to be part of that discussion. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, and really looking forward to interrogating you later about the findings of that analysis. So thank you for that. Okay, I can see that about 70% of our listeners have voted. Some interesting results coming in. So we'll leave it open for another minute or so. If you haven't voted, it's easy to do. So yeah, please give us your thoughts on that question. Okay, So let's dive in then to the first of our sort of usual slides that we bring to you. So the question, and it feels like this has been the question for quite some time, is how close are we to 2019 capacity? This week's data shows us that we're within touching distance almost. Feels like that, John, doesn't it? 17.8% below the same week in 2019.
I'll take your word for it, Deirdre. I can't see the slide. There you go. Yeah, much easier to see now. Yes, we're just over the 90 million mark again this week. So that's the second consecutive week we've been above that threshold, which is good. Slightly down on the previous week though, and yeah, we keep seeing capacity being cut for the next 3 months. But there's an interesting pattern to it. This week we saw about 7 million seats being cut for the next 3 months, but the biggest proportion of those are actually in May, and as a direct result of the ongoing lockdowns in China, with airlines cutting capacity at less than 2 weeks' notice. So it's you know, that's frustrating because they're cutting some big numbers regularly. 5 million seats week on week get dropped out of the system, which is frustrating because if in normal or in a better recovery scenario, we'd be at 95 million. Although in comparison, at the peak of 2019, we got to about 119 million seats a week. So yeah, we're making progress. No doubt about it. Still some way to go. I'd be very doubtful if we're going to get above 100 million by the summer. My instinct
feels ambitious, doesn't it?
Yeah, 12th of August is the busiest day of the year in terms of planned capacity at the moment.
It's just about here.
If you've got a ticket booked for that day, you might want to think about rescheduling it for a quieter day, or make sure you're not traveling at 6 o'clock in the morning in Europe for sure. So it's yeah, it's getting there. I think we will do 95 million, perhaps 96 in the peak couple of days in August, but it's a lot better than last year. There's no doubt about that. A lot better than last year.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Thank you for that, John. Let's have a look now regionally then at what's going on underneath those numbers. So we and this is a slightly different time period, so we're looking now at months, and that kind of level is similar, isn't it? So we're 16.5% down in May versus May 19. We can see quite clearly here the the wide variation in China capacity. We pull that out separately because we know it has such a marked effect on the global total. But there's a general positive trend, isn't there?
I think the sentiment is really good. The growth in all markets is strong. I was on a webinar last week and I said that this has been a global pandemic, but everyone's had their own personal, and every country's had its own personal set of circumstances. And that goes for the regions as well. But every region in the world is looking more and more positive. There are some regions and indeed countries that are ahead of previous year and indeed 2019 capacity levels, which is great. China's aspiration for that amount of capacity in June 22 has as much chance of happening as Leeds United staying in the Premier League this year. It's
feels a bit optimistic, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's more than optimistic. I mean, it's flying a kite, quite frankly, but it's unrealistic. I think what will be an interesting dynamic, and China is an interesting point towards this, is as we entered the pandemic, we know lots of big domestic markets saw an increase in domestic flying. Now, as we begin to flip back out into international flying, then the aircraft that the airlines have available are going to be flying longer sectors than is currently the case in many circumstances. So actually, we could see a net reduction in capacity as international markets recover. because we're going to see longer stage lengths, less flights, and China is a case in point. So, you know, we need to just monitor that and be aware that we may see some unintended consequences from a better and more liberalised international recovery.
Yeah, I think Vietnam's another one that we've commented on that's quite similar. They've done very well, haven't they, with their domestic market through the last 2 years. But it's really good news this week. They've decided to stop the testing, pre-arrival testing. So I think the first country in Asia to do that. So, you know, it's good to see this Asia line moving upwards, but it's sort of interesting to think that, yeah, maybe we might see capacity not improve at the same rate just because of the mix of capacity between international and domestic. Interesting thought, isn't it? We're going to have some complexity trying to interpret how the trends are.
We are, aren't we? And I'm not sure that's something that when I sort of think how our reporting on this has evolved over time, that probably wasn't something that was on our radar to look at. But yeah, I can see that I think we'll probably be getting into that maybe towards the back end of the summer, won't we? Having to look at that, particularly as we see some of the bigger markets in Asia begin to recover. Hopefully.
And with some of the US carriers now, and you know, using A321s to do transatlantics, and United starting services to very secondary markets for the peak summer season, you know, that's taking capacity from elsewhere in their network and adjusting the mix. And airlines will want to do that quickly, because typically you're going to get a better yield on an international sector than you are on a domestic sector. And of course, those international sectors bring connecting domestic passengers as well. So airlines want to have that structural change taking place.
Yes, as soon as they can, really. Interesting also to see Latin America really performing well in terms of capacity reaching recovery. That's obviously been driven by Mexico and Colombia and Brazil to some extent are all strong domestic markets, but also recoveries building there. And we this afternoon we have a speaker from Sao Paulo who's joined us before, and there's going to be lots of interesting conversation, I think, about what's going on there and how the market there is recovering back. So join us again if you can bear to listen to us twice in one day, or you can access the recording through OAG's website.
I think, Deirdre, one last shout out for Africa, which, you know, has performed extremely well in the last couple of months, particularly West Africa. Or West Africa was performing well before irony of ironies. The price of jet A1 fuel in Nigeria became so expensive. Domestic carriers cancelled all their services last week, electing to fly international routes. But also another story from Africa that's emerged in the last couple of days is the sale of South African Airways for the princely sum of $3 which is a phenomenal price to pay for the airline, really, given that it doesn't exist in any shape or form at the moment. But it shows you
price that, isn't it?
It's more than a fire sale, but it also shows you where South African Airways had got to, and you know, all of the issues, the politicizing of the company. It's a great shame, because it should, in theory, be quite a successful airline. But $3, I think I got $2.75 in change, if anyone's interested in joining me with a 25-cent coin.
That would be an interesting joint venture if ever there was, John. Okay, let's turn to our next slide now, which we're going to take just a bit more of a look at China and this sort of up and down spikes in capacity that we referred to. Becca, do you want to talk to us about
I think we often show a slide like this or something similar, just seeing how capacity's changed week by week. We can use a snapshot to look back at previous points in time. And I think we've taken a snapshot every 2 weeks for the last 8 weeks. what's interesting is that bottom thick line, you know, 1 week the capacity's up, and then it's down, then it's up, then it's down. So that's what John was talking about. We're seeing these big movements. And when we look at global data, we need to understand that this is happening in China, because it's affecting the top line numbers every week. As John said, sometimes they're certainly taking out 5 million seats compared to where the schedule is just 2 weeks ahead. Very short-term planning, and this isn't going to improve quickly. You know, we know that we're not going to be up at that sort of 17, 18 million seats for some time now. So, and I think there's been changes again in China this week in terms of restricting travel again. So we're going to see this all summer, going up, down, I think.
I think you're being very complimentary to call it short-term planning, Becca. I think it's, you know, it is firefighting, isn't it? You know, it is. Yeah. And for the airlines, it must be, as much as for the people affected, it must be so frustrating to be putting a schedule out there, then having to consolidate, take staff out of rosters and programs and all sorts of things. And this is driving, as you mentioned, all of the weekly numbers. And what we see in the weekly numbers, the schedule volatility in most other parts of the world has really stabilized now. You know, we're talking maybe less than 1 percentage point swings in many parts of the world at the moment. And the one exception is here, Northeast Asia. And of course,
but they can do this partly because they, you know, where other parts of the world, I think we've touched on this before, have furloughed staff. In China, typically, the staff are still around. They're being paid less, but they're available to come back. So they can, you know, switch on capacity, turn off capacity in a way that other markets can't. I think elsewhere, airlines have had to get to grips with how do you manage in this sort of volatile environment. Do you permanently keep your capacity a bit low, or you plan it in for a longer period of time at a lower level, because you're managing your resources as well, and your staff in particular. And we can talk later about what's happened with cancellations elsewhere because the staffing issue's been a bit of a crunch. So this is a uniquely Chinese pattern, but it's not going to change over the next few months.
It's still a nightmare, though, isn't it, for everyone in the system? You know, it's still a nightmare for the airports on the ground who are trying to anticipate what demand's going to come, and even though, you know, they may have staff waiting in the wings, it's still operationally the challenges involved with, you know, and anticipating 5 more million or 5 less million passengers, or, you know, 2 weeks out is a significant one. It shouldn't be underestimated.
And whilst this gets a lot of our attention at the moment, it actually diverts us away from thinking about what is the real issue here, which is when will China reopen for international travel? And, you know, this, every time we see these numbers, it just, in my mind, knocks it back. I can still talking about when will China reopen in the second half of 2023 at this rate. You know, there's no urgency from the Chinese to reopen. There's no urgency from the European airlines at the moment for China to reopen, given other issues in overflights and routings, as we discussed last month. So it's a real, and China does hold many markets in Asia to ransom effectively, because it's a very large part of their trade links and their international networks.
So having said that, on our earlier slide, you know, we've seen steady recovery in the Asia Pacific, the Asia market, you know, Asia without China, and it's still recovering, and it's now at 20% or so below where it was in 2019. So actually, it is recovering without China. There's a chunk that won't, you know, that it really needs China, but the Asian markets are finding a way to recover.
And I think let's drill down into that, because actually we're going to see in some slides that are coming that I think there's a twin track story going on, being driven really by strong domestic markets in India and Indonesia, which are boosting capacity growth elsewhere. I think the interesting question is, you know, that point you made, John, about, you know, if we're now talking about the back end of 2023, we're 4 years on from what was normality, if 2019 was normality. And actually for for source markets that were heavily dependent on the Chinese tourist, you know, how long do you wait around for that market to come back? It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable to have waited this long for your source market to come back.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, very difficult.
Okay, let's look then at some of these country markets. So what we're seeing and what we've done here is gone down a layer from the charts there that showed Asia excluding China and China separately. And we're looking at country level. And what we're showing you here, these are, if you look at OEG's regular weekly reporting on capacity, you might be familiar with some of these visuals. But what we're showing you here is essentially capacity for each of these countries, and we picked a sort of representative sample of some of the bigger countries in the region. And then we're showing you the percentage change in capacity for this month versus May 19. So, you know, how is recovery tracking on that measure? And then we're also showing you month on month. So how is capacity for May 2022 looking versus last month? And you know, it's an interesting story, isn't it? As we were saying, you know, India strong. It's one of only 2 countries on this measure to be above 2019 levels. Vietnam is the other one. Both countries with India obviously with a massive domestic market. Vietnam has also done very well in returning its domestic flying to normality. But there's quite a sea of red here as well, isn't there? You know, in terms of not even 50% of capacity that was operating in 2019 is currently operating.
We have such a long recovery ahead of us. And, you know, ASPAC is probably 3 to 6 months behind the rest of the world in the recovery process. What we've seen in other markets, which I think is, you know, something we can be positive about, is recoveries are happening probably quicker than we expected. Consumer confidence has been really strong in Europe and in North America. Less so in Southeast Asia, talking to some of our colleagues in the industry there recently. But, you know, if you look at Malaysia, I think Malaysia is a great example. If you look at the second column, wow, it's 44% up in capacity compared to April. That's great, it's reopened, but it's still 40% down against where it was in 2019. And similarly, Singapore, you know, that's still at only half of its normal capacity at this moment in time, despite being nearly 15% up month on month.
I think where we're seeing that, the green, the Malaysia 44%, Vietnam 24%, these are responses to openings, to what governments are doing to relax the rules, aren't they? And we are seeing where that action is taken, that travel is, you know, or capacity is coming back quite quickly, and that'll be largely in response to demand. These airlines will be doing that because there's demand there. So, you know, we still need governments to take action and work to open markets, don't we?
We do. I mean, my worry, I think, is, you know, that pent-up demand is only short-term demand, and many airlines are benefiting from that, you know, spurt in demand, higher average fares, the ability to actually squeeze a bit of revenue on selected days and flights, which is great and absolutely necessary. But once everyone's done that one trip or maybe that second trip, you know, they've got to go back into the offices and they've got to go back to work, and we'll get back to normal travel demand profiles in many of these countries. Now, that then becomes an issue when corporate demand appears to be still down by 20 to 30%. And September and October, when the corporate market begins to pick up, you know, the third quarter and the fourth quarter, is that demand going to be there? Probably not in the same volumes. I think everyone accepts corporate demand is not going to be as strong as it was. So it's great we've got this, but what's it going to shake down like towards the end of the year?
So we've got a question in from Peter about, is that if China did open, would these other airlines in Asia have the capacity to, have they got enough capacity to serve those markets? And do we see Japan and Taiwan opening up? I think there's movement on Japan, isn't there?
Yeah, in Japan, we're hearing some positive noises about a broader opening in the late third quarter of this year. We've heard that there is a plan to allow groups to travel to Japan, leisure groups to travel to Japan, as long as it's on an itinerary that's been agreed and the authorities know where everyone is at every moment of the time. You might as well go to North Korea if that's the type of trip you want to go on, and that's not what Japan is about. So yeah, that's slowly opening as well. I think, to answer Peter's question, if I was an airline and China opened, I would find the capacity to fly there, and if that meant reallocating domestic aircraft to do international flying, I would do it. Because it will be more profitable than domestic services. There is huge pent-up demand, and I think airlines will find a way to supply that capacity.
Too big of a market to ignore, isn't it?
You can't afford to ignore it. And I think the other thing is, let's not forget, many airlines have got most of their fleets back flying, but the average daily utilization on those aircraft is still very low by historic standards. So there is plenty of capacity that could be developed by more effective aircraft utilization.
Yeah. Okay, let's go down another layer and look at some of the biggest hubs in the region. And it's even to some extent, it's even more stark, isn't it? When you go down to airport level. What we're showing you, similar table here. So the May 22 capacity versus 19, and then May this year versus April. We're also looking at just a snapshot of international routes that were operating in May 19 from each of these airports. What's the position currently and the percentage reduction, and it is a reduction for all of them. And then to try and understand, some of this, and I guess to illustrate some of the things that we've been saying about China and the impact that it has on some of these other markets in the region. What was capacity by some key source markets in May 19? So you can see for somewhere like Incheon, for example, China and Hong Kong and Japan, really important. 40% of Incheon's capacity. Similarly, Taipei and obviously Hong Kong, hugely reliant on China and Japan. So when we see really stark figures here, down at just 20% of pre-pandemic levels of capacity operating, it's not a massive surprise, is it?
No, it's I mean, these country markets and these airports are all inextricably linked to each other in terms of their capacity profiles and their demand profiles. And until you break this virtuous circle of disaster, it's not going to improve for many of them. Hong Kong is in an awful situation. Who would have thought Hong Kong? It's even worse for Hong Kong. They've just, or were about to commission the third runway, invested a lot of money in new terminal development, and we're about to enjoy the benefits of all of that, and then suddenly someone's thrown the brakes right into the market. And Hong Kong, of course, was 6 months further into a crisis anyway, because of the social unrest that was taking place, was damaging tourism, probably from about October of 2019 anyway. So these numbers are not good, Deirdre, and it's frustrating, I think. It's also for places like Incheon, of course, although they have a domestic market, it's not a very large market. You know, it is one of the busiest routes in the world, or one of the few domestic routes they have is one of the busiest in the world to Jeju Island. But Hong Kong has no domestic traffic. And of course, when Hong Kong does reopen, it is going to be in the context of a broader opening in line with China and increased competition in the Greater Bay region, because, you know, Macau, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, they're all starting again from exactly the same position as Hong Kong, rather than 2.5 years ago, where Hong Kong was ahead of them,
At the
had
edge.
a network.
But with
and
airlines that have been flying throughout, you know, the Chinese airlines based in, you know, China Southern in Guangzhou and so on, they've been flying. They haven't, you know, had to park aircraft in the same way, have they? So they've operationally they're there and ready to go in a way perhaps that Cathay isn't.
And some of these the locally based carriers in some of these markets, you know, are a bit like Emirates. They're stranded with very large aircraft types. So I think of Singapore Airlines, and you know, it's difficult because you can think about Scoot, and then you can think about their other low cost subsidiaries and their fleet mix. But the main line Singapore brand is full of wide-bodied aircraft, and you know, still has a relatively large A380 fleet. They're not selling all of the seats on those aircraft. I mean, one of our colleagues flew from Singapore to India recently, and you know, it was still, what row would you like to yourself, sir? So there's a lot of wide-body capacity that's flying around that is too large for the market's needs at the moment.
I think this just really, you know, drilling down into this really illustrates for me that the pattern of recovery is really different in different parts of the world, and that we've seen that throughout, haven't we? You know, we've seen different markets recover in different ways throughout geographically. I think what's interesting to me is it's really clear that when you look at, you know, Delhi and Jakarta, two of the biggest domestic markets in this list, you know, is what's protecting and driving growth in those two countries. And actually, we, you know, to just illustrate that, I guess, you know, if we look at 2019, I think this was just May 2019, the share of domestic capacity of totals at these airports was significant, and obviously Japan, Haneda as well. And it's no coincidence that these are the markets that are closer to recovery.
And it's also no coincidence that, you know, if you were looking at Delhi, Jakarta, and Manila, and sadly, to a lesser degree, Kuala Lumpur, all four of those never really became true international hub airports. They may have had a specific international flow that they traded in, but they were not global hubs. They were not connecting large volumes of international to international passengers. You know, Delhi Terminal 3, the original aspirations, 10, 12 years ago, was that it was going to rival Dubai. Well, you know, the facility is outstanding. The unfortunate thing is that the national carrier Air India is and has been a disaster for many years. And Haneda, until what would have been last year, was essentially a complete domestic airport with a few international regional services. That was only going to open to international or expanded international capacity last year, or 2020, with the Olympics. Never happened, and is slowly rebuilding. So you know, those airports, their domestic network may appear to have saved them in terms of capacity and maybe a bit more demand, but the international flows in some of these places are truly atrocious at the moment.
And meanwhile, you know, the rest of, if you look at the recovery of other global hubs, there's a real step change, isn't there, in terms of difference between them as they start to recover.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in the Middle East, the hubs there are growing back pretty quickly. In Europe, some of the hubs are, 80–85% capacity of what they used to be. And airlines are reporting good load factors, and demand is very strong through the summer season. I think the danger here, of course, is that these airports and these markets will miss the IATA summer season. In terms of demand recovery, you can't see any of these seeing a dramatic step change in capacity or international demand in the next 2 or 3 months. Primarily because Japan is still effectively closed, Taiwan is still effectively closed, and of course we've mentioned already China.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to a little bit more of a positive story. We thought we would just take a look at Australia and New Zealand. We saw on the previous slides that I think Australia is now just 11 or 14% behind where it was in 2019. And that's really been a good news story, hasn't it, for Australia and New Zealand managing to reopen. And I think New Zealand is now reopened for tourism as well, isn't it? If not fully open, then it's on that trajectory, isn't it?
Yeah, which probably means another series of Lord of the Rings being shown on Sky TV soon, I should suspect. Yeah, it's good that New Zealand's reopened. There's nearly 3 years of VFR traffic and grannies and in-laws and all sorts of people who are probably stranded in Singapore at the moment, going in one direction or the other, trying to get to see families. And Australia,
and that's driving a lot of this, isn't it? All of this. I mean, these percentages are phenomenal, but it's really because there was nothing. This is just year on year comparison, isn't it? But this is that surge that we were talking about in terms of, the pent up demand to get to visit family, to do the trip of a lifetime that's been postponed for 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And people have embraced the opportunity and are out there traveling, and it's wonderful. Earl's Court in London has probably never been busier than it is at this moment in time with Australians over here. So it's all good, and this is two-way traffic. So a lot of this at the moment, I think, is probably coming up from New Zealand and Australia to take advantage of the Northern Hemisphere summer rather than going down. I can't think of anything that could be more depressing than a winter's day in Melbourne. So it probably is a bit of a directional flow. But it's good to see these coming back, and there's lots happening in Australia. Project Sunrise, the announcement of the non-stop Sydney service, the A380 is coming back on their flagship service to Heathrow. Qantas acquired Alliance there last week. Air New Zealand starting their JFK service, going to be one of the longest routes in the world. So there's lots of good news stories happening there, and once you're open, it's very difficult to close the door. So that's good in itself. They can't go back to lockdowns again.
Let's hope not. Let's hope not. I think it's interesting, isn't it, though, that it does feel that there's an air of positivity, and there are developments in the market, and the market is starting to function again in Australia and New Zealand, which is fantastic. And I look forward to hopefully not too many months down the line where we're having this conversation about Asia Pacific, and the wider Southeast Asia region. Okay, let's go on to look at, we mentioned earlier on that we were going to look at some cancellations data. There's been a lot of negative press in Europe and the UK, as we said, largely because markets are reopened, we're moving back towards recovery, but there's been a lot of negative press about, and there have been on the ground, lots of airport congestion, people waiting in incredibly long queues, staffing concerns driven by COVID, driven by, you know, airports understandably because of all of the challenges that they've faced in the last 24 months, have had to let people go, just like airlines have, and building back up to cater to the levels of demand that we're seeing in the peaks is a challenge. So we thought we would have a look at cancellations data just to see, you know, is the story as bad as it's being played out? What's happening across different parts of the world? Typically, pre-COVID, the average cancellation rate was about 1%, wasn't it? That's what we saw. And now we saw that spike up in the early months of the pandemic. But really, now what we're seeing obviously are some, you know, the spikes here, which look bad on the charts, but, you know, are only up to 6%, 10%, a little higher in North America on some limited occasions. These are typically being driven by either weather events. This, I think, was snow in Turkey. I think these were weather events in North America as well. But actually, we're seeing cancellations running not massively above trend, are we? I mean, headaches in Europe, you know, we know about that. But actually, I think the story is not as depressing as I thought it would be.
No, it's you know, it's a Daily Mirror sensationalism, isn't it? Type sort of story. And the reality. Let's put this all in context, if we can, please. Many parts of the world, we're now seeing capacity, the number of flights being operated, sometimes up to 300 or 400 times higher than the same week last year. Airlines had no choice but to furlough staff who during the pandemic may have lost their ratings, may have lost their type licenses and had to be brought back in, many of which decided they preferred a lifestyle outside of aviation. What happened is, you know, just another classic case of authorities allowing markets to reopen without planning and allowing airlines to sufficient time to plan for these recoveries. I remember last year, the Board of Airline representatives in Australia said that it would take 6 months for them to renew the necessary licenses for air services to continue. They weren't given 6 months notice. You know, everyone is scrambling around for staff. British Airways offer £1,000 for any new employees 3 weeks ago. EasyJet this week matched the offer. You know, it's not long, Deirdre, before I'm going to start wearing a skirt and doing my safety drills again. You know, it's worth it.
I'm sure they could find you a pair of trousers, Sean, for that. The prospect of a skirt is maybe a step too far.
We have seen, haven't we, John, though, that I think the likes of BA have made announcements about just reducing some of their operating schedule for the next few months, though, just so that they can stay on top of this. So they know that there's negative publicity with cancellations. So better to my point earlier, plan it in, you know, know that you're going to be a bit constrained and therefore just not be quite so ambitious with the schedule and manage the cancellations. You know,
and we saw that last month in the US as well, didn't we?
Yeah, you know, that preparation, that pre-planning, managing the event and being proactive rather than reactive also allows you an opportunity to sell those last 20 seats, probably, you know, 30% more than you otherwise would have done. So it makes sense for them, particularly when fuel's, you know, twice the price it was this time last year. I just think, you know, this is one of those great pieces of sensationalism that the airline industry allows itself to get hit with, when rather than actually collectively getting on the front foot and said, well, you know, we're responding to the government's requirements for security checks and all of these things, quite rightly so, but with 2 months notice and a 6-month process, what would you expect us to do?
And of course, I was going to say elephant in the room. It's not really the elephant in the room. The China figures, we know what's driving that. Okay, let's move on to our last area that we're going to talk about, and this is the effect on airports of different sizes. Now, back to the poll that you all kindly responded to at the outset. 55% of you thought that large airports would have suffered most, 27% thought that small airports were worst affected, and 18% of you took the middle option and thought that medium airports were most affected. We're going to come on to show you in a moment what the numbers show. But Becca, do you want to talk us through what we did, what our approach was to this?
Yeah, so this has come out of a discussion we've had amongst ourselves for a while now about which are the airports that have been most affected and which are the sort of flows between airports of different sizes. So we're going to be looking at both. Mm-hmm. This slide here just shows a summary of airports globally. We looked at all of the OAG data for 2019 for full year and put every airport into one of 5 tiers. So the biggest ones, the tier 1s, were over 25 million seats. Tier 2, 10 to 25 million departing seats, that is, in the year, and so on. So you can see the numbers there. You can see how many airports fitted into each category. In brackets in that second column, we've got how many there were in the last 12 months. So we based the tiers on 2019, but just to show you that there were fewer airports in the larger tiers, which is no surprise because they're not operating such capacity, and there's a few more in the tier 5. And then some stats there about the share of seats that makes up. So these tier 1 airports in 2019 made up 35% of all capacity, but only 1% of airports. So that's just some headline numbers. So then we looked at, I think the next slide, Deirdre, was so this says, how has capacity changed by tier? So the tier 1 airports, so here's the answer to the poll, they have lost more capacity as a proportion than any other airports. So the average was about 22%, and for April this was, rather than May, but the tier 1 at 30% or so. Tier 2 about the average, and then the smaller airports, as a proportion of their capacity in 2019, have lost less capacity. I don't know, is that a surprise? Is that what we're expecting?
The previous slide I think is fascinating. When 35% of the world's capacity is in terms of 1% of airports.
1% of airports, yeah.
What happened to Pareto's law and the 80-20 rule? It's just profoundly scary. And I mean, we've done research in the past, and if you actually look at ownership by airport groups, then there's 1 or 2 very large airport groups who own a very significant share of the world's airports. So I find that staggering, and just shows how fragmented the market is, and how much, if you look at the bottom on that previous slide, how many airports are in that tier 5, how many of those are fulfilling social service type needs around the world, but more importantly, how many of them can be profitable or even attempt to be profitable?
Yeah. Okay, so let's look then at the next
so this is where this is where we get into the meat of the analysis. What we then did was look at every tier of airport to every other tier. So we've got numbers here, 1, 1, 1, 2. That's from tier 1, or between tier 1 airports and tier 2 tier 1 airports, between tier 1s and tier 2s. So it's both directions. So where it says 2 to 3, that's from a tier 2 to a tier 3, and from a tier 3 to a tier 2. And these are still global numbers. So quite an interesting pattern, really. And one of the things that's interesting is seeing some of the smaller airports, the 2 to 3s, the 3 to 4s, in some ways not doing as badly as we might expect. And it's just, and the 5 to 5, the very smallest to very smallest airports, unsurprisingly, capacity's fallen off quite a lot there.
And these are going to be primarily domestic, aren't they?
Yes, yes, they are. So obviously,
all domestic.
Yeah, it's mostly the tier 1s and tier 2 airports that have international traffic. The only one that's positive in that chart on the right is 3 to 5, which, in some ways is quite surprising to me. So these are small, they're not large airports, the 3s, and they're serving very small airports. But we'll come on to that. That's a sign of the experimentation that we've seen by low-cost carriers, which we've talked to in many webinars before.
And I think also reflects the type of networks that you would see at a tier 1 airport, and as we say, a lot of this is about high frequency routes where that high frequency is not being served at the moment. And that's therefore that doesn't reflect very well on the tier 1s to the tier 2s and the tier 1s to the tier 3s, the ones to ones. Whereas if you've only got one flight to a regional destination, we've seen that in Europe. I mean, KLM at the very beginning of the pandemic, and you'll remember Wilco on a couple of webinars was telling us KLM's strategy was to make sure every European destination was served at least once a day, so you could get some connectivity. It might not be great connectivity, but you could at least get some connectivity.
So you're maintaining that network, I guess. That's the that's
absolutely. And if you've got to spend 6 hours in Amsterdam, then go and have a look around the art gallery and go and play on the casino.
I'm sure Wilco will be back at some point down the line to give us an update on that. Okay, let's look at this specifically in the context of Southeast Asia, because I think what's really interesting, you were talking there, John, about it's better to retain a level of connectivity. Many of these routes in Asia, the kind of key trunk routes that you talk about here, Becca, which are the ones that are hit hardest, have multiple carriers operating on them. We did a piece of analysis a few years ago now, where we looked at all of those busy routes by region, and the average, typically was, I think, something between 2 and 3 carriers on those big busy routes. In Asia, it was way up at, above 6-7 carriers per route. We've seen, haven't we, in the US, obviously, with the whole Frontier, Spirit, JetBlue story that's playing out at the minute. We saw last week an announcement by Avianca and GOL, and we'll talk about that later this afternoon, that there's a plan for some consolidation and sort of deeper collaboration. Is this going to happen in Asia? We've just seen, haven't we, that in terms of recovery, Asia's on a different trajectory, particularly in Southeast Asia. Taking a step back, it feels to me like there must be consolidation coming.
There's more sacred cows in Southeast Asia than there are in other parts of the world, though. Airlines are still viewed as extensions of national flags in many cases, however badly they perform.
And this chart on the bottom left here, shows just how important these hub airports are, these tier 1 airports. In one of the differences when we compare Southeast Asia to the other regions we've looked at with this same analysis is that there's very little of this 2 to 3, 2 to 5. 3 to 5. There isn't regionality in the same way in Southeast Asia that there was elsewhere. It's not spread out across all sorts of airports and people flying all over the place. This is a market that is really all about going to and from hub airports. And as John says, those are sacred cows, and those are, countries have been more reluctant to allow situations where that gets opened up to more competition.
Is in a sensible world, is there really a requirement for Malaysia Airlines and Singapore Airlines to be 2 separate entities? Is perhaps one entity with a big hub in Singapore and a domestic network operating out of Kuala Lumpur, a more effective use of resources for both countries, and likely to be more profitable and sustainable in the long term. Because we've got to think about sustainability in every sense of the word, not just the environment, but profitability, etc. But it's very difficult. Southeast Asia and Africa are the two continents and regions in the world where you see it's challenging for consolidation because of the complexity and the nationalism that's still at play in those particular markets. We saw Korean and ASEAN merge or announce their merger, but obviously they're in the same country. Maybe you could see that happening in Taiwan, where EVA and China Airlines would make sense to be a separate entity. But then again, these are equally quite large markets, and the local consumers would say we need competition. We need some degree of competition in those markets.
Yeah, and I guess consolidation potentially moves you away from that, doesn't it?
But does it, or does it actually re-energize the market because a new entrant thinks there's a gap in the market I can come into? Is consolidation actually a catalyst for market change and structure? If you read some of JetBlue's latest rhetoric about why it wanted to acquire or is interested in Spirit, we admire their management team, we admire their brand values. Lots of sound bites that actually are completely inconsistent with what JetBlue have been saying about Spirit for the last 10 years. So yeah, it's fascinating.
So it's always different when there's a potential purchase on the cards, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can change your mind as quickly as you want. I think it's fascinating. The pandemic was not a moment for consolidation in the industry. I think now is a moment for consolidation in the industry, and we'll probably see another couple of quite big announcements about consolidation, strategic partnerships, whatever we want to call them, in the next 18 months as the recovery rebuilds.
But it's still harder to anticipate what those might be in Asia than perhaps elsewhere in the world. I don't know if you saw Avianca and GOL coming, John, but what might be potential consolidation targets in Asia?
And I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Because when you look at the Avianca and GOL network, and this is the trailer for our afternoon webinar here, you can see the kind of logic and sense in a collaboration, can't you? In terms of how you then face the competition, which is the LATAM group, in market coverage across such a large geographic area. It's a really valid question, Becca. What is what's the potential prize? What's the opportunity in Asia or in Southeast Asia specifically to gain the kind of synergies that this might give the combined Avianca and GOL operation?
Yeah, I see a weakness in the Avianca and GOL network when you visualize it on those network maps, in that GOL is essentially a regional airline. It does have some services up to Florida and into the Caribbean, but it's essentially a regional airline. It doesn't provide any European connectivity whatsoever without a massive backhaul to Bogota. And no one's going to do that from the markets that it serves. So, is this a precursor to Avianca actually finding a way to step into the Brazil-Europe market? The competition isn't all that strong. TAP have a big share of the Brazil market. You wouldn't classify them as one of Europe's strongest airlines. So maybe that's the play that's going to emerge out of here.
Interesting. Let's hold that thought, and we'll come back to that later today. But I think it does beg an interesting question. If we are moving into this kind of new phase of consolidation or collaboration at this at this part of recovery, what will the future bring for Asia and Asian carriers. Interesting times ahead, I think. I think we're all almost out of time. I think we're on 9 o'clock. Any final thoughts to share from either of you this morning?
I think, you know, that general sentiment of positivity is still there. I think we're going to see more action in Asia, but as we've said so many times, China and Japan, come on guys, you know, you need to reopen and let the rest of the world recover as well, please.
I think for me, I've been looking at some of the fuel surcharges in the last couple of weeks, and they're not in place everywhere in the world, but certainly some markets, the transatlantic and in particular, it's giving the airlines an opportunity to make some money, I guess. I'm hoping that they're making some money and rebuilding their balance sheets in this time. So capacity may still be down a bit, but we're hearing that yields are you know, fares are certainly high in some markets. And so, you know, it's not all about, we talk a lot about capacity because that's data that we've got to hand and it gives us a forward view. But if it's about making money, then there's also some good signs, I think, out there. Perhaps more so in Europe and North America than Asia Pacific, but where we're not seeing the fuel surcharges put in place in quite the same way.
Okay, thank you for that positive note. I think we'll end it there, Becca. Thank you. We'll be back, as we said, later this afternoon, focusing more on Latin America and other parts, Western Europe and North America. The next webinar is going to be a month from now, so we will hopefully see some of you, if not all of you, back on the 15th of June. You can sign up in the meantime for regular updates, which will give you access to the sorts of data that we've shared with you today on just continually tracking the recovery. And of course, OAG's blog comes out every week where you can read more of John and the rest of the team's thoughts on what's happening in the industry. Thanks to everybody for listening and for joining us today. And we'll
one last thing. Can I just say good luck to Burnley and Everton in the next few days, please?
That's a reference that's probably lost on a fair amount of the audience, particularly me, John.
Quite a few people will understand.
Okay, right. On that note, let's wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.